July 15, 1997, Miami Beach. A Tuesday morning, warm and impossibly bright, the kind of morning that makes South Florida feel like paradise. The ocean sparkles a few blocks away, palm trees move in a soft breeze. The streets of Ocean Drive are just beginning to fill with the first tourists, the early joggers, the cafe workers setting out chairs for the day ahead. A man walks down the sidewalk carrying a stack of newspapers and magazines. He has just come from the news cafe at the end of the block, his morning ritual, the same walk he makes almost every day when he is in Miami. He is tanned and relaxed, wearing simple clothes, smiling to himself. Nobody who passes him on the street that morning seems to realize who he is. But that does not matter to him. He is not performing. He is just alive, on a beautiful morning, in the city he loves most. He reaches his home, a mansion so extraordinary that people slow down when they pass it, just to look. He climbs the steps, he puts his key in the front gate, and then the morning shatters. 2 gunshots. Gianni Versace, the most powerful and celebrated fashion designer on earth, collapses on the steps of his own home. His newspapers scatter across the tile. He is 50 years old. He is dead within minutes. The world will spend the next 8 days hunting the man who did this. When they finally find him, he too will be dead, and he will leave behind no explanation, no confession, no reason, no answer to the question that has haunted investigators and fascinated the public for more than 25 years. Why Gianni Versace? Out of every person on earth, why him? What was the connection between a serial killer on the run and the king of global fashion? That question has never been fully satisfactorily answered, and that silence at the center of the story is part of what makes it impossible to forget. But before we get to the murder, before we get to Andrew Cunanan and the trail of bodies he left across America, you need to understand what was lost on those steps. You need to understand the extraordinary, improbable story of how a poor boy from the edge of southern Italy became the most influential fashion designer of his generation. Because without that story, the loss does not make full sense. Reggio Calabria sits at the very bottom of Italy's boot, across a narrow strip of sea from Sicily. It is a city of ancient history and hard lives, a place where the mountains meet the coast and the old world has never quite let go. Not the place most people would expect to produce a global fashion empire. But then Gianni Versace was not most people. He was born here in 1946, the second of 3 children. His father sold household goods for a living. The family was not poor in the way that meant hunger, but they were not comfortable either. What they had was their work, their community, their sense of who they were. And his mother, Francesca Versace, had her sewing. Francesca was a dressmaker. She ran a small atelier from their home, a workshop where the women of Reggio Calabria came to have their most important garments made, dresses for weddings, for confirmations, for occasions that mattered. And from the time Gianni was old enough to sit still without being a nuisance, he sat in that workshop and watched. He watched everything. He watched how his mother chose a fabric, the way she would hold it up to the light, run her fingers across it, feel the weight of it. He watched how she cut, how she fitted, how she adjusted. He watched the moment when a woman would put on a finished garment, and something would visibly shift in her posture, in the way she held her head, in the way she looked at herself in the mirror, and he understood with an instinct that could not have been taught, that what his mother was doing was not just making clothes, she was making people feel different about who they were. There is a story people who knew him used to tell. As a small boy, Gianni once watched his mother finish a ball gown for a wealthy client. The woman came for her final fitting, put the dress on, and stood in front of the mirror. For a long moment she said nothing, then she started to cry, not from sadness, but from the feeling of being, for that moment, exactly who she wanted to be. The young Gianni stood in the corner of the workshop watching all of this. Afterward he asked his mother, "Did you do that?" She said, "The dress did that." He never forgot it. That story, in a sense, contains the entire philosophy of everything he would ever create. By his teenage years, he was not just watching anymore, he was working. He learned to cut, to sew, to construct. He developed the technical foundation that would later make him one of the most skilled practitioners in the world. But the technical skills were almost incidental. What was growing in him was something harder to name, a visual intelligence, a way of seeing color and pattern and the human form in relationship to fabric that most people simply do not have. He dreamed in design. He saw solutions to problems that other people had not yet identified as problems. He also read voraciously Greek and Roman art, Byzantine mosaics, Renaissance painting. The visual history of the Mediterranean world poured into him and mixed with everything he was learning in his mother's workshop. The result was a young man who, by his early 20s, had a point of view, a coherent, original, fully formed way of looking at beauty that was unlike anything else in Italian fashion. The only problem was that nobody in Reggio Calabria was going to give him the opportunity to use it. At 25, he packed a bag and moved north to Milan. And this is where the story stops being a fairy tale, at least for a while. Milan in the 1970s was the capital of everything that mattered in Italian fashion, and it was ferocious. Designers arrived from every region of the country, hungry and ambitious and certain of their talent, and the city's response to most of them was indifference. The industry had its established houses, its established names, its established way of doing things. It was not looking for a young man from Calabria with unconventional ideas and nothing to offer except a portfolio and a belief in himself that some people, when they first met him, found alarming in its intensity. He was rejected. He was kept waiting in rooms. He was told his ideas were too much, too bold, too risky for the market. He worked for other designers, doing the invisible labor of someone trying to learn the industry from the inside while watching lesser talents get opportunities he was not given. There were months, long months, when it was not at all clear that this was going to work. When the distance from Reggio Calabria felt not like freedom, but like exile. He kept working anyway. He was constitutionally unable to stop. People who knew him in those years describe a man who seemed to operate on a different clock from everyone around him, as though he had more hours in his day, more energy in his body, more capacity for sustained creative output than any ordinary person could sustain. Rejection did not demoralize him, it sharpened him. Every door that closed gave him more to prove. And the thing he was building in his mind, the aesthetic world he was developing through all those years of work and study and refusal, was becoming more and more specific, more and more his own. In 1978, at 32 years old, Gianni Versace launched his own label. The first collection showed in Milan, and for the first time the fashion world did not look away. The designs were unlike anything on any other runway. Bold where others were restrained, explicitly, joyfully sensual where others were structured and cerebral. They used color with a confidence that felt almost dangerous. Gold and black and deep, saturated reds and blues that looked like Byzantine mosaics come to life in fabric, and underneath all of it was a philosophy that was simple and radical at the same time. The human body is not a problem to be solved by clothing. It is the point. Fashion should celebrate it, not apologize for it. That philosophy hit the market like a stone hitting water. The ripples went out in every direction. Within a few years, Versace was one of the most talked about names in fashion. Orders came from the most important boutiques in Europe and America. The press devoted pages to every new collection. And then the celebrities came, and that is where the story of Versace becomes something larger than the story of a designer. Gianni Versace understood something that very few designers in the world fully grasped at the time. He understood that who was wearing your clothes was part of the story of the clothes themselves. That fashion and celebrity could create something together that neither could create alone. He was not the first designer to dress famous people, but he was among the first to treat it as a genuine creative collaboration rather than a marketing exercise. In 1994, Elizabeth Hurley arrived at the London premiere of Four Weddings and a Funeral, wearing a black Versace dress, held together at the sides with large, gleaming gold safety pins. The dress was extraordinary, aggressive, and elegant at the same time, a piece that asked something of the person wearing it. Hurley later said she almost wore something else that night. It was a last-minute decision to put on the Versace. She was nervous about it. It felt like a risk. The next morning her face was on the front page of every newspaper in the world, not because of the film, because of the dress. Overnight, Elizabeth Hurley became a global star of a different magnitude, and the dress became one of the most famous garments of the entire decade. Versace told her it would work. He was completely right. And that anecdote, that single moment at the bottom of a red carpet, tells you everything you need to know about how he thought. He did not dress people, he transformed them. He built real friendships with Diana Ross, Elton John, Bruce Springsteen, Tina Turner, Princess Diana. These were not transactional relationships, they were genuine bonds, the bonds of people who shared something, a way of seeing the world, an understanding of what it meant to live at the edge of your own talent. When he designed a stage costume for a musician, he was not thinking about the fabric. He was thinking about the person inside it, about how the costume would change the way the performer moved, how it would change the way the audience felt watching them. He thought in total experience. And then there were the supermodels. Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, Cindy Crawford, Claudia Schiffer, Christy Turlington. These women were becoming the biggest stars on earth, transcending fashion into genuine celebrity. Versace worked with all of them, and what he gave them was something other designers did not always offer: a partnership. These women were not hangers for his clothes. They were collaborators. They were part of the vision. The famous image, Naomi, Linda, Cindy, and Claudia walking the runway together, arm in arm, laughing, radiating a joy and power that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the ordinary, that image became the symbol of an entire era. It was Versace who made it happen. He was the person who understood that putting those four women on one stage at one moment would create something that would outlast every individual piece of clothing in the collection. It was theater, it was culture, it was fashion at the level of mythology. But while all of this was happening in public, the shows, the celebrities, the cultural dominance, there was a private man living a life that the world only partially understood, and the gap between his public image and his private reality shaped him in ways that few people ever saw clearly. Gianni Versace was gay. He had been in a relationship with Antonio D'Amico for more than a decade by the time the house reached its peak. He did not hide who he was in his personal circles, in the circles of fashion and music and art where he moved most freely. It was simply part of who he was, and nobody questioned it. But the broader public world of the 1980s and early 90s was a different place. Fame creates visibility, and visibility in that era came with specific risks for gay men. The AIDS crisis was devastating the communities Gianni moved in. Friends were dying, the fear was constant, and the question of what to say publicly, how much to acknowledge, how to be honest without handing ammunition to people who might use it, these were real calculations that he and the people around him had to make constantly. Fame had given him power, but fame had also built a glass cage around his life. Everything he did was watched. Every friendship was analyzed. The tabloids of the era were not kind or careful about the private lives of public figures, and Gianni was wealthy enough and famous enough to be a target whenever someone decided he was worth writing about. He managed all of this with extraordinary skill. He was warm and open with the people he trusted, private and careful with everyone else. He created a world for himself in which he could be fully himself, and he protected that world fiercely. His deepest refuge was his family. His sister Donatella was always near, always part of the creative process, always the person he called when he needed to think out loud about something that mattered. She was his muse in a real sense. He saw in her a quality of boldness and glamour that fed directly into his creative vision. His brother Santo handled the business side with a precision and intelligence that gave Gianni the freedom to focus entirely on creating. Together, the three of them were the true architecture of what Versace had become, one dreaming it, one protecting it, one running it. In 1992, Gianni bought the Casa Casuarina on Ocean Drive in Miami Beach. He spent years transforming it into something that looked like his own imagination made physical: mosaic tiles, gilded ceilings, a swimming pool lined with gold leaf, frescoes in the courtyard. It was extraordinary, and it was also, in a strange way, deeply personal. This was not a showpiece. This was where he actually lived when he was in Miami. This was where he walked around barefoot in the morning, where he swam before the city woke up, where he sat in the courtyard with coffee and read everything he could get his hands on. He loved Miami with a simplicity that surprised people who expected him to be more complicated about it. He loved the light. He loved the warmth. He loved his morning walk to the cafe. He loved the fact that in this city, at least partly, he could just be a man walking down the street. What he did not know, could not have known, was that someone was watching those walks, someone was studying his routine, learning his movements, waiting. But we will get to that. First, there is something that happened in 1994 that most people do not know about Gianni Versace, something he kept almost entirely secret, something that, had it become public at the wrong time, might have changed everything. In 1994, Gianni Versace was diagnosed with cancer, a rare form of inner ear cancer, specifically a diagnosis that arrived without warning, that upended everything, and that he chose to share with almost no one outside his immediate family and closest friends. Think about what that means for a moment. This is a man who's by 1994 one of the most watched and discussed figures in the world. There is no version of his life that is entirely private. His shows are global events. His friendships are tabloid fodder. His every move in Milan and Miami and Paris generates coverage. And in the middle of all of that, he is sitting with a cancer diagnosis, sitting with the possibility that everything he has built, everything he has become, could be cut short, and he is bearing it in silence. The treatments were brutal. He endured them privately, continuing to work through them because stopping was not something he knew how to do. People in his inner circle who did know say that the experience changed him in a way that was difficult to name but impossible to miss. It was not that he became quieter or more cautious or less driven. It was more that he became more intensely present, as though he had learned to feel the texture of each day differently, to notice things he might previously have moved past too quickly. He recovered. Publicly, nothing changed. He came back to the runway with new collections that were as bold and extraordinary as anything he had ever done. But privately, something had shifted. He knew now, knew in his body, in a way that abstract knowledge of mortality does not teach, that nothing was guaranteed. Not health, not success, not time. He was 50 years old, and he was living with an urgency that the illness had made even more acute than it had always been. He had survived once. He was not naive enough to assume he would always survive. He had no idea what was already moving toward him. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Andrew Cunanan. And Andrew Cunanan is, in many ways, the most disturbing figure in this entire story. Not because of the scale of his violence, but because of how thoroughly he defies easy explanation. He was 27 years old in the spring of 1997. On the surface, he was attractive, articulate, socially adept in the way that people who are fundamentally dishonest can sometimes be effortlessly, endlessly, to a degree that eventually becomes its own kind of horror. He had grown up in San Diego, the son of a Filipino father and an American mother, and from his earliest years he had been performing, not living, performing. He invented stories about his background, his wealth, his connections. He told people he was the son of a plantation owner, that he had studied at elite schools, that he knew important people in ways that mattered. Some of it was technically close to true, most of it was fantasy so detailed and so consistently maintained that people found it easier to believe him than to question him. He moved through the wealthy gay social circles of San Diego and San Francisco and New York, attaching himself to older men, living on their generosity, spending money he did not have on the lifestyle his invented identity required. For a while, for several years, it worked. He was invited everywhere. He was charming at every party. He was the person that hosts wanted at their table because he made the room feel more interesting. But it was unsustainable, and eventually it all began to collapse. The money ran out, the relationships ended. The men who had supported him grew tired or suspicious. The stories he had been telling for years began to develop cracks, and the cracks began to show. By early 1997, Andrew Cunanan was facing something he had never faced before. the reality of who he actually was, stripped of the performance and the borrowed glamour and the illusions he had maintained for so long. And whatever was inside him when that performance finally fell away, whatever the real Andrew Cunanan looked like without the costume, it was something that had no tools for coping with the world. In April 1997, he killed a man in Minneapolis, a former lover. Then, days later, a second murder, equally cold and deliberate. He took a truck and drove it across the country. He killed a third person in Illinois, then a fourth in New Jersey. His face went up on FBI wanted posters. His name went on the 10 most wanted list. Law enforcement agencies across the country were looking for him. Hotels and businesses in major cities were warned to watch for him. By any rational assessment, he should have been caught within days. He was not caught. He made his way to Miami Beach. He checked into a cheap hotel a short distance from the Casa Casuarina, and he waited. The question of why he chose Versace has never been satisfactorily answered. They may have met briefly years earlier at a party in San Francisco. There is some evidence of a fleeting encounter, but investigators who have studied the case in depth believe that any real relationship between Cunanan and Versace was largely a product of Cunanan's imagination, another story he told himself about his own importance and his own connections that grew, in his fractured mind, into something with weight and meaning that it never actually possessed. It is possible that killing Gianni Versace was, for Andrew Cunanan, a way of writing himself into a story large enough to feel real, a way of proving that he mattered, that he existed, that the world would have to stop and take notice of him at last. If that is what it was the most terrible and most futile logic imaginable. But whatever his reasoning, it was moving toward its conclusion. And on the morning of July 15, 1997, it arrived. The morning began like every other morning. Gianni Versace woke early in the Casa Casuarina, as he almost always did when he was in Miami. He may have swum first, he often did, in the extraordinary pool in the courtyard, in the early quiet before the city fully woke up. Then he dressed simply and walked out into the morning. Ocean Drive was just coming to life. The light was the particular gold of a South Florida morning, warm and flat and drenching. He walked a couple of blocks to the News Cafe, nodded to the staff who knew him, selected his newspapers and magazines, a stack of them, the same ritual every time, and turned back toward home. He may have stopped to speak to someone on the street. He was that kind of person in Miami, present, unhurried, happy to be recognized and exchange a few words. He was not a man who moved through the world behind a wall of security and urgency. He moved through it openly. It was one of the things he loved about this city and this neighborhood, the feeling of being able to simply exist, without performance, without armor. He reached the steps of the Casa Casuarina, 14 steps from the sidewalk to the front gate. He climbed them, he put his hand in his pocket for his key. Behind him, the ordinary sounds of a Miami morning continued. Traffic, birds, the low-frequency hum of a city at the start of another day. Andrew Cunanan had been watching. He came up those steps from behind. He raised the gun. He fired twice into the back of Gianni Versace's head. The newspapers fell. The magazines scattered across the mosaic tiles. The most celebrated designer of his generation collapsed onto the steps of his own home. A neighbor came running within seconds. Antonio D'Amico, who had been inside the house, heard the shots and came to the door and found what was on those steps. He had spoken only rarely about that moment in the decades since, and when he has spoken about it, the words always seem inadequate to the scale of what he found there. Passers-by stopped. Someone recognized the face. Someone called an ambulance. A crowd began to gather with the terrible speed that tragedy always seems to generate, but there was nothing to be done. Gianni Versace died on those steps. He never regained consciousness. Within hours, the news had reached every corner of the world. The fashion houses of Paris and Milan went quiet. Supermodels who had walked his runways wept openly in front of cameras. Princess Diana, one of his closest friends in his final years, was among those who were utterly devastated. She herself would be gone within 6 weeks in a tunnel in Paris, and those who had known both of them would later speak of that summer of 1997 as a kind of rupture, a moment when something irreplaceable in the world simply ceased to exist. The manhunt that followed was unlike anything Miami Beach had experienced. A serial killer loose in the city, having just murdered one of the most famous people on earth, the fear was real and immediate. Hotels posted his photograph at their front desks. Residents were warned. Police flooded Ocean Drive. The FBI coordinated with local law enforcement in a search that spread across the entire city. For 8 days, Andrew Cunanan seemed to vanish. And then, on July 23, police received a tip about a houseboat moored near the marina, not far from Versace's mansion. Officers surrounded it. From inside, they heard a single gunshot. When they forced entry, Cunanan was dead on the floor. He had shot himself in the head. He left no note, no letter, no confession, no explanation of why he had done what he had done, or what his precise connection to Gianni Versace had been, or what he had been thinking in those weeks of waiting outside the Casa Casuarina. The investigation continued for months afterward, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, trying to reconstruct a coherent narrative from the fragments he had left behind. And investigators reached conclusions about the probable nature of his fixation on Versace, about the likely delusions that drove him, about the spiral of violence that had consumed the last months of his life. But the precise truth of why Andrew Cunanan chose Gianni Versace as his final victim has never been established with certainty, and that unanswered question has become part of the story's permanent shadow, a silence at the center of it that no amount of investigation or speculation has ever been able to fill. Some things that happen in the world do not yield to the human need for reason. This may be one of them. In the days and weeks after the murder, while investigators were still working and the world was still in shock, the Versace family faced a different and more immediate crisis. An empire that had been built entirely around one man's genius, his vision, his relationships, his irreplaceable creative intelligence, had to decide whether it was going to survive. Donatella stepped forward. This was the moment that defined the rest of her life. She had always been in the room. She had been Gianni's muse, his confidant, the sister he spoke to about everything that mattered. But she had always been in his shadow, and the shadow of a man like Gianni Versace was enormous. Now that shadow was gone, and she was standing alone in the full unforgiving glare of the world's attention, with a global company to protect, a workforce to keep employed, collections to design, a brand to maintain, and a grief so total and so sudden that by her own account she could barely function in the first weeks. She has been honest about those years in interviews, almost brutally honest in a way that commands respect. She has talked about the addiction that consumed her for a period in that aftermath. She has talked about the mornings when she could not get out of bed and the shows she somehow got through anyway. She has talked about the pressure of knowing that every choice she made was being watched and judged against a standard set by a man who was gone. And she has talked about the moment when something changed, when she stopped trying to be Gianni and started being herself, when she allowed herself to build on his foundation rather than simply honor it. That shift saved the company. It may have saved her. She came out onto the runway after her first collection and received a standing ovation. People were clapping not just for the clothes, though the clothes were extraordinary, but for the fact that she was there, that she had shown up, that against everything that had tried to destroy her, she had kept making. The House of Versace continued to grow. In 2018, the Michael Kors Group acquired it for more than $2 billion. Donatella remained as creative director. The shows still happen, the name still resonates from every runway that matters. But the numbers and the acquisitions are not the legacy. The legacy is in the language Gianni Versace created, a vocabulary of glamour and desire and the celebration of beauty that designers across the world absorbed and built on without always knowing where it came from. He changed how fashion thought about the human body. He changed how fashion thought about celebrity. He changed how fashion thought about color and boldness and the relationship between the person wearing the clothes and the world watching them wear those clothes. He proved that fashion could be popular and serious at the same time. He proved that dressing beautifully was a form of intelligence, a form of power, a form of joy that deserved to be taken seriously. And he proved that where you come from, how small the city, how ordinary the origins, how little the world expects from you at the start, does not determine what you are capable of building. The Casa Casuarina is a hotel now. Tourists can sleep in the rooms, have dinner in the courtyard, swim in the gold leaf pool. They can walk up those 14 steps and stand at the front gate and look at the spot where his newspapers fell. Some of them take photographs. Some of them just stand there in the morning light trying to feel the weight of what happened here. Princess Diana, who was among the most devastated when Gianni died, was herself gone within 6 weeks. In the summer of 1997, it felt as though the world was losing something it had no name for, a quality of life and beauty and audacity that certain extraordinary people carry with them and that does not survive their absence. Gianni Versace lived too fast and worked too hard and loved too loudly and was taken too soon. He was 50 years old, and at the absolute height of his powers he had survived cancer. He had outlasted every rejection and every closed door. He had built one of the most recognizable names in human culture from nothing but raw talent and absolute conviction. And he died on an ordinary Tuesday morning on the steps of his own home for reasons that no amount of investigation has ever made fully legible. There is a photograph of him backstage at one of his final shows. He is surrounded by the organized chaos of the last minutes before the runway, models everywhere, the music already starting, assistants moving in every direction, and he is laughing, fully, completely, without performance. He is laughing at something or someone just out of frame, and he looks like a man who is exactly where he was born to be. That image is the truest record we have of him. Not the headlines, not the crime scene photographs, not the true crime documentaries and the dramatized miniseries and the decades of speculation about Andrew Cunanan's motives. Just a man backstage laughing in the middle of making something beautiful. The empire he built still stands. The name still moves through the world with a power that most brands never achieve. The influence runs through the work of 100 designers who came after him, in the boldness of their color, in the way they think about the body, in the understanding that fashion at its best is not just clothing but a form of expression so powerful it can change how a person feels about who they are. A boy from the edge of Italy who dreamed in color and refused to stop, who carried the lessons of his mother's workshop across a continent and transformed them into something the whole world wanted to be near, who built friendships that lasted and work that lasted and an idea about beauty that has lasted long past the morning when it was most brutally tested. Some people leave marks on the world that do not fade. Some lights, when they go out, leave a darkness that takes a very long time to fill. Gianni Versace was one of those people, and the world even now has not quite finished missing him.